All right, welcome everyone. Let's dive deep today into Philippians 2, 5 to 11. You know it, I know it, but we're not going to rehash the obvious stuff. We're going deeper, looking at how pastors are bringing this passage to life in unique ways.
Yeah, we've got some sermon analyses here that are really going to make you think. It's amazing what you can find when you start digging a little deeper.
So let's kick things off with the Swamp Mennonite Church sermon. Now, I'll be honest, I had no idea what a Swamp Mennonite was before this.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with them either.
Turns out they're Anabaptists,
Yeah.
known for simple living, deep community, and their take on Philippians 2, 5 to 11. Well, they used a card game analogy that really caught my attention.
A card game. That's different. Tell me more.
The game is Rook, and the pastor talked about how he loves to lose the bid on purpose, just to take down the player who's getting a little too cocky.
Okay, I see where this is going. It's not about winning or losing in the traditional sense.
Right, exactly. It's about playing the long game, even if it means taking a seemingly weaker position.
Kind of like how Jesus emptied himself, took on the form of a servant, went to the cross. It's embracing that position of seeming weakness to achieve a greater victory.
Right. So how does this translate for our listeners, the pastors and Bible study leaders? What can they take away from this Rook analogy?
I think it challenges our assumptions about power and success. You know, we live in a world that equates those things with dominance and control. But Philippians 2, 5 to 11 flips that script.
It's a reminder that true greatness is found in humility, in selflessness, in a willingness to serve others, even when it means taking that quote-unquote losing position.
You got it. And that message resonates with everyone, no matter their background.
All right, switching gears now. We've got a sermon from PCC Paracenter Chrétien, a French evangelical church, and their take on humility was fascinating. They presented it as a transformational journey.
Not just a static virtue, but a process.
Yeah, like they're saying, embracing humility isn't a one-time decision. It's a continuous process of dying to self and letting Christ live through us.
Right. It's not just about being humble, it's about becoming humble.
A spiritual makeover.
Haha, I like that. And it's an important distinction because it reminds us that humility isn't a destination. We don't just arrive at it. It's a journey.
A journey with twists and turns, ups and downs.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message for pastors to share. Instead of just telling people to be humble, help them understand what it means to walk that path.
To live it out.
Yes, to make humility a tangible reality, not just a concept.
Okay, let's move on to the Granville Chapel sermon. This one really dug into the historical context surrounding Philippians 2, 5 to 11. They contrasted the absolute power of ancient rulers with Jesus' model of servant leadership.
Yeah, they used imagery like pharaohs and Assyrian kings, all decked out in their royal gear, demanding obedience.
And then boom, you see Jesus washing feet, healing the sick, ultimately sacrificing himself on the cross.
Such a powerful contrast. It really hits home the radical nature of Jesus' humility, especially when you consider the historical context.
It wasn't just about being nice. It was about overturning the entire power structure.
Totally. In the ancient world, power was about dominance. But Jesus redefined it as service and sacrifice.
So how can pastors use this historical context to bring the passage to life for their congregations?
I think they could explore the cultural expectations surrounding leadership in the first century. You know, compare Jesus' actions with other historical figures like Caesar Augustus or Pontius Pilate.
It's about helping people see that Jesus wasn't just talking about humility, he was living it out in a way that was revolutionary.
And that message is still revolutionary today, especially in a world that often equates leadership with dominance.
All right, let's keep this momentum going. We've got another sermon analysis here, this one from Living Hope Church, and they use this really cool analogy to contrast self-centeredness with Christ-like humility.
Oh yeah, I remember this one. They called it the here I am versus the there you are mindset.
Right, so the here I am mindset is all about me, 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 drawing attention to myself, seeking my own glory, focusing on my own needs.
It's that look at me mentality that we see so often in the world.
And then you have the there you are mindset, which is all about shifting our focus outward, recognizing the needs of others and seeking to serve them, putting the spotlight on others instead of ourselves.
And that ties in beautifully with the idea of kenosis, right? Jesus emptying himself, taking on the form of a servant.
It's about letting go of our ego, our need to be in control, and surrendering to God's will.
This analogy is so practical, anyone can relate to it. It makes you stop and think, okay, am I operating from a here I am or a there you are mindset right now?
Yeah. It's a great conversation starter, a way to help people examine their own hearts.
It could also lead to discussions about how to cultivate that there you are mindset. How can we be more aware of the needs of others? How can we shift from self-promotion to service?
Those are great questions. And they get to the heart of what it means to live out Philippians 2:5-11. It's not just about understanding humility, it's about embodying it.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Speaking of walking the walk, the WM Ministry Sermon had this fascinating concept about the fall and how it disrupted humanity's connection with God.
Oh, right. They talked about how adopting the mind of Christ is key to restoring that connection.
And that really resonated with me. It's like humility isn't just about being a good person. It's about aligning ourselves with God, with the source of life and love.
It makes you wonder, if the fall broke our connection with God, could embracing humility be the way to repair it?
That's a powerful thought. And it's a powerful way to frame the message of Philippians 2:5-11 for our congregations. It's not just about being nice. It's about reconnecting with God, with who we were created to be.
And that reconnection is what gives us purpose, joy, true fulfillment. It's about aligning our hearts with God's heart.
You know, it strikes me that all these sermons emphasize the practical implications of this passage. It's not just lofty theology. It's a blueprint for living a life of love, service, and humility.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why it's so relevant today. It speaks to our longing for a better world, a more just and compassionate world.
And it reminds us that the change we long for starts with us, with our willingness to humble ourselves, to put others first, to embrace the way of Christ.
It's not always easy, but it's the path to true joy and fulfillment.
It's about discovering that true greatness comes from emptying ourselves, not puffing ourselves up.
And that's a message the world desperately needs to hear.
All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground here in part one.
We have, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover as we continue our deep dive. It's amazing how these sermons take this familiar passage and really breathe new life into it, you know?
Yeah, it's like they're giving us a fresh pair of glasses to see it with. It's still Philippians 2:5-11, but it's like we're seeing it for the first time.
And that's what's so exciting about this deep dive, right? It's about rediscovering the power of this passage.
Exactly. And it's not just about abstract concepts. These sermons give us tangible ways to understand and apply the message.
Like the Living Hope Church sermon, they use this beautiful image of a poetic ladder to illustrate Jesus' journey.
Oh, yeah, that was powerful. It wasn't just a list of things Jesus did. It was a way to visualize his descent from heaven to earth, then to the cross, and ultimately his ascension.
It was like a roadmap for the whole passage, and you could feel the impact it had on the congregation.
It's amazing how visuals can make such a difference, right?
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of visuals, the Granville Chapel sermon used a brilliant tactic to highlight the contrast between Jesus' kingship and earthly rulers.
Oh, yeah. They showed images of pharaohs and Assyrian kings all decked out in their royal finery, demanding obedience. And then, bam, they switched to images of Jesus washing feet, caring for the sick, and sacrificing himself on the cross.
It was like night and day. It really challenged our preconceived notions about leadership.
Because let's face it, we often associate leadership with power and authority.
Right.
But Jesus flipped that script.
Exactly. He showed us that true leadership is about service and sacrifice.
Which brings me to something I noticed in a few of these sermons. They emphasize that humility isn't about burying our talents.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about downplaying our gifts and abilities.
Not at all. It's actually the opposite. It's about recognizing that our talents are gifts from God, and they should be used for His glory, not our own.
So instead of clinging to the spotlight, we step back and say, okay, God, how can you work through me?
Exactly. And that requires a level of obedience that goes beyond just being a nice person. It's about surrendering our will to God's will.
Even when it's tough or doesn't make sense to us.
Right. But let's not forget the other side of the coin, the exaltation. Philippians 2:5-11 doesn't end with Jesus' sacrifice. It ends with him being lifted up.
Ah, yes, the victory. It's a crucial part of the message, especially for those who are struggling or discouraged.
Because ministry is hard. Life is hard. People need to remember that humility isn't about losing in the end.
It's about trusting that God has a bigger plan, even when we can't see it.
That even when we're serving behind the scenes, God sees it, and He honors our faithfulness.
It's a reminder that our value doesn't come from our accomplishments, but from our relationship with God.
You know what else I appreciate about these sermons? They weren't afraid to get personal.
Oh, you mean how they shared stories and examples from their own lives?
Exactly. It wasn't just about abstract ideas. It was about how those ideas play out in our relationships in our daily lives.
It made the message so much more relatable and impactful, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of relatable, That Rook analogy from the Swamp Mennonite sermon was genius. It was so unexpected, but it perfectly captured the essence of Jesus' strategic humility.
It's like, here's this pastor talking about a card game, and suddenly it becomes this profound insight into the mind of
I
Christ.
know, right? It also highlights that humility isn't about being passive or weak. It can be incredibly strategic and powerful.
Because so often we picture humility as being meek and mild. But Jesus' example shows us that true humility can be bold and transformative.
And the Living Hope Church sermon reinforced that with the here I am versus there you are mindsets.
Oh, yeah, that was a great one. It's such a simple way to check our focus. Are we trying to draw attention to ourselves? Or are we genuinely looking out for the needs of others?
It's about that constant self-reflection, asking ourselves, am I living out the selflessness of Philippians 2:5-11?
That's a challenge. But it's a challenge that can lead to incredible transformation.
Because when we shift our focus from ourselves to others, we actually open ourselves up to a deeper level of joy and fulfillment.
It's like that old saying, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.
And that's where the power of the gospel comes in. It's not just about following rules. It's about letting God's love reshape our desires, our motivations, our entire being.
It's about becoming more and more like Christ.
And these sermons also emphasize that we don't have to do this alone.
Oh, you mean the importance of community?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They highlighted the role of other believers in our lives,
Yeah.
people who can challenge us, encourage us, and hold us accountable.
Because let's be honest, humility is hard. We need each other to stay on track.
You know, another thing that stood out to me was how these sermons talked about the joy that comes from choosing humility.
It's like they're saying that humility isn't about deprivation. It's about finding true fulfillment in aligning ourselves with God's will.
And that's where true joy comes from. It's not about getting what we want. It's about finding our place in God's bigger story.
And that story is always about love, about serving others, about giving ourselves away.
And that brings us to another key theme, the importance of prayer. We can't live out Philippians 2:5-11 in our own strength. We need God's grace.
We need to be constantly tapping into that divine power source, asking God to help us humble ourselves, to show us the needs around us, and to empower us to love like He loves.
It's a beautiful picture. This idea that as we surrender to God, He fills us with His love and strength, enabling us to do things we could never do on our own.
And that leads us to another important point, the importance of context.
Oh, you mean how the message of Philippians 2:5-11 might resonate differently depending on the audience?
Exactly. We can't just assume that everyone will immediately understand the nuances of this passage. We need to be sensitive to their backgrounds, their experiences, their current struggles.
And that's why it's so valuable to be exposed to different preaching styles and approaches.
Because what works for one congregation might not work for another.
It's about being willing to experiment, to step outside our comfort zones, and to find those creative sparks that ignite a passion for this passage in others.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about delivering information. It's about connecting with people's hearts.
You know, as we're talking about all this, I'm struck by how much wonder these sermons evoked. It wasn't just about analyzing the text. It was about marveling at the mystery of the incarnation.
The idea that God Himself would humble Himself to become one of us.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of wonder is something we need to cultivate, both in ourselves and in our congregations.
Because it's so easy to become jaded, to lose that childlike awe that draws us into the heart of the gospel.
We need to remember that we're not just dealing with words on a page, but with the very heart of God.
And when we approach this passage with that kind of reverence, with that open-hearted wonder, it can't help but transform us.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on, because ultimately that's what Philippians 2:5-11 is all about, transformation.
It's about letting God's love reshape us from the inside out.
Okay, so we're back for part 3 of our deep dive. You know, one thing that's really been hitting me as we've gone through these sermons is that Philippians 2:5-11 isn't just some personal, piety thing. It's about how we act in the world.
Absolutely. So many of these sermons talked about how this passage clashes with the world's values. It's countercultural, you know?
Yeah, like the world saying, look out for number 1. But Philippians 2:5-11 is saying, put others first. It's a total mind shift.
Right. So the question is, how do we help our congregations actually live this out? It's easy to talk about, but to actually do it when the world's pulling you in the opposite direction, that's tough.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with creating spaces where people can wrestle with these ideas.
Yeah.
Where they can grapple with that tension between the world's values and what Christ calls us to.
So not shielding them from the world, but equipping them to be in it, but not of it.
Exactly. And that might mean challenging the way things are, speaking up for the people society pushes aside, or even just making little choices every day to put others' needs before our own.
It's about showing that humility isn't weak. It's actually where real strength comes from.
And something these sermons really drove home for me was how they redefine leadership.
Yeah.
In light of Philippians 2:5-11.
Yeah, it's not about throwing your weight around. It's about lifting others up.
Right. It's about serving, not bossing people around.
And that's something we need everywhere, not just in churches, but in workplaces, communities, even government. Imagine if our leaders really lived out the humility of Christ.
Oh man, that would be revolutionary. But it starts with us, right? We have to be the ones showing what it looks like to lead with humility.
And that brings us back to practical application. I mean, it's great to admire Jesus' example, but we have to actually, do something.
Like that story from the Living Hope Church sermon, remember? The person giving up their seat on the bus for the older woman.
Oh, yeah. It's a small thing,
Yeah.
but it shows what Philippians 2:5-11 looks like in action.
Those little choices, those moments when we choose to put others first, they matter.
And hopefully they inspire others to do the same.
Exactly. That's how we start to change things. One act of humility at a time.
As we're wrapping up, I'm feeling challenged, but also hopeful,
Yeah.
because Philippians 2:5-11 can seem impossible. Sometimes it feels like we're trying to swim upstream,
But we're not alone in this, right?
right? We've got the Holy Spirit working in us, guiding us, helping us change from the inside out.
And we have each other, the community of believers who are in this with us.
So to everyone out there, to the pastors and Bible study leaders, don't be afraid of this passage. Don't water it down. Don't shy away from its power,
Embrace how radical it is. Let it change you. Then let it pour out into your sermons, your teaching, your everyday life.
The world needs to hear this message. It needs to see humility in action. It needs to see the love and grace that come from a heart surrendered to Christ.
And maybe, just maybe, if we're faithful to this message, to these upside-down values of Philippians 2:5-11, we can help bring about a world that reflects God's heart.
That's a great thought to end on. Thank you for being with us on this deep dive into Philippians 2:5-11.
It's been a privilege.
And to everyone listening, keep digging deeper. Keep asking those questions. Keep letting God's word transform your life. And we'll see you next time.